We're going to be talking about the book of Job tonight, which is one of my favorites. Interesting, fascinating, really beautiful book. Before we do, though, let me explain how we got here. So we've been in the series, The First Gospel, seeing the goodness of God through the story of creation, all the way through from the very beginning. And we've kind of done a narrative approach where we started with the creation story, talked about how God designed the world and how he intends it for good, how things kind of went sideways in Genesis chapter 3. We call it the fall, but how immediately God put into action a plan to set things back to good. He is always working for good. He's always working goodness, even in the middle of brokenness. And that plan to put things back to good involved a guy named Abraham that he called to be the father of a new nation that would come to be known as Israel. So Abraham is the first of the patriarchs, the fathers. Thank you, Mike. It sounds much better. I appreciate that. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Abraham's son Isaac, Jacob his grandson. Then led us to the Joseph story, which we spent a couple weeks talking about Joseph and his remarkable journey into Egypt, where he would eventually save his entire family from a famine, and they would move to Egypt and settle with him there. That kind of kicks us into the book of Exodus, where we saw that after about 400 years, the people of God had gone from being guests in Egypt to being slaves in Egypt. And God delivered them in miraculous ways. That's the Exodus story, the leading out of Egypt. It's this great escape, this great rescue story. We talked about that in some detail, and God led them then from Egypt into the promised land, where he taught them how to live as the free people of God. And they spent the next 3 books, 3.5 books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, wandering around in the wilderness for a period of 40 years. Before they were able to move into the promised land. So then we moved into the book of Joshua. We didn't really talk about it, just sort of mentioned it, that the book of Joshua is all about the conquest of the promised land, Canaan, that God had given them. They move in, they take over, and then we kicked into the story of Judges. And we talked about some of the crazy Judges stories, this guy named Gideon and a guy named Samson, and kind of that whole toilet bowl approach, how things just get bad and worse by the end of Judges. And at the end of the book of Judges, the beginning of the book of 1 Samuel, the people of Israel are demanding a king as the solution to their problems. We've had a really rough time under all these sort of tribal chieftains. We want to be a united kingdom like all the other kingdoms around us and have a king that's going to be in charge. And God, though he knew this wasn't best for them, he gave them what they were asking for. So this kicks off the period of the monarchs. So we have 3 of them in succession. Saul, we talked about a little while ago. David, and then we spent the last 4 weeks talking about some of David's most famous works, because David is most famous for the Psalms. So we took a little bit of break from the story of the Kings to talk about David's writings in the book of Psalms, the prayer book of the Bible. And now I'm not going to dive back into the story of the Kings, but just mention the next one that comes along is David's son named Solomon. So he'll be the next king of Israel and the last king of the united kingdom of Israel. So Saul, David, and Solomon were able to consolidate power, the 12 tribes, under one king. After Solomon, and we'll talk about this later, after Solomon, he has a son named Rehoboam who makes some big mistakes, and the kingdom will divide into 2. So after this, we won't have a united Israel ever again throughout the history of the Bible. They're northern kingdom and southern kingdom. So Solomon, David's son, is the last king of the united kingdom of Israel. He's a really unique guy. He's not David's oldest son. That's something that's a little bit unique. So he's not the one that we would think of as the hereditary heir of Israel. But we have already established in the Bible this kind of pattern where God routinely chooses the one that's not the oldest, not the most likely. David himself wasn't the oldest, right? So it shouldn't be a surprise to us that God chose somebody other than David's oldest son. As a matter of fact, David's oldest son was a guy named Absalom. We skipped over this part of the story, but Absalom actually tried to kill his own father David and chase him out of, for a while he succeeded in chasing him out of his own palace. And Absalom eventually died in battle, and David was able to return to Jerusalem. His next oldest son is a guy named Adonijah. And Adonijah, when his father was starting to get pretty old, this is in 2 Kings, decided it was time for him to assume the throne. He just assumed he was the next guy in line, so he assumed he's the guy that's going to take over next. But God had already selected Solomon as the next heir. Solomon's mother, you might remember, is this woman named Bathsheba, who is one of David's biggest mistakes. It's a massive mistake that he made. They had their first child died shortly after it was born. The second son was Solomon. And Bathsheba, when she had Solomon, went to David and begged, "Can you promise me that he'll be king?" And David made that promise to her at the time. Now, when David started to get pretty old, it was clear he was on his last leg. Adonijah went and declared himself king. When Bathsheba heard about this, she went to David and said, "You promised me that Solomon would be the next king." So here Adonijah is declaring himself king over here, and David in Jerusalem is declaring Solomon king. Now Adonijah heard that Solomon was proclaimed king at the same time that he was announcing himself king. Things got a little bit awkward. But eventually it was clear that the power lay with Solomon in Jerusalem and not with Adonijah. So he sort of groveled and was able to come back into the fold for a while, but eventually Solomon took control of the entire kingdom of Israel. And when he did, this is what he's most famous for, he prayed a prayer to God asking for what? Do you guys remember? Asking that God would give him wisdom to rule over Israel. Now this is a really interesting thing, and God was apparently so impressed by this prayer that he said, "You know what? Most people in your position would have asked me for two different things. They would have either asked for power over their enemies or wealth. But you've asked me for wisdom. And because you've asked me for wisdom, I will give you that and the other two things." And so Solomon becomes the wisest king in the history of Israel. And because of and through his wisdom, he also rules over the enemies of Israel in such a way that there was peace throughout his entire reign. There was no war. He was able to expand the borders of Israel's territory through treaties and through marriages and different alliances. And he presided over the wealthiest time in the history of the country. So he had this 40-year period of peace. He was able to solidify power. He was able to invest into the country. He was a great builder, so great buildings. He built the temple, most famous for building the temple, and this really wise king. And so because of that, Solomon is known as the ruler or the kind of founder of wisdom literature. So if you read the book of Proverbs, many of these proverbs, which are wisdom books, are attributed to Solomon. There's also another book that we call the Song of Solomon or the Song of Songs. That's another wisdom book that's attributed to him as well. Also, the book of Ecclesiastes, which nobody's entirely sure who wrote it, but some people think that Solomon maybe contributed to that one as well. So we're going to talk for the next few weeks not about Solomon, because there's not much more to his story than what I've just said. I mean, we could dive into some details here and there, but really about what he inspired, which is wisdom literature. When we talk about wisdom literature in the Bible, there are 4 books that we're talking about: Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. They are wisdom books that teach us what wisdom is and what it looks like when we live it out. And I want to give just a really quick definition of biblical wisdom before we go into the actual story of Job tonight, okay? So Bible's version of wisdom is not what the world tends to think of. The world tends to think that wisdom is knowledge, that it's being really smart. Somebody who's wise is really smart. They know a lot of things. In the Bible, that's really only half the equation. The other half is that they take what's in their head, which is right thinking, and they apply it to their lives in right living. So the biblical definition of knowledge or wisdom is thinking and living properly, living rightly. Now the Bible tells us 3 really clear things about knowledge, okay? About wisdom, excuse me. The first one is this: nobody has it by default. Nobody is born with wisdom. There are people who are born smarter than others. There are people who are born geniuses. But nobody is born with wisdom. Wisdom has to be acquired from outside yourself. In other words, you have to seek it. You have to go after it. You have to want it. Nobody's just wise internally. They have to pursue wisdom. You have to desire it. You have to, as Solomon did, you have to ask for it. Which leads to the second thing the Bible teaches us about wisdom. The place to find it, according to the Bible, is with God. When we read the book of Proverbs, in Proverbs chapter 1, it says what? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Okay, so the starting point for your pursuit of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, or it's seeking or living in awe of God. That's where wisdom starts. And if we've been paying attention to the biblical story so far, that makes sense. God made the world. He made all of us. If there's anybody that knows how we ought to live, it's going to be Him. So if you want to know how to think well, how to live well, how to be the person that you were designed to be, you go to the source. You go to the architect. You go to the one who created you. So the fear of the Lord, the awe of God, worship is the beginning of wisdom. So it has to be sought. The place you seek it is by going to God. And then when you receive what He tells you, when you receive the wisdom He gives you, you have to live it out. The last thing is wisdom has to be applied. If you don't live it, you're not actually wise. You can be intelligent, you can be learned, you can have had an encounter even with God, a genuine spiritual experience. But if that doesn't translate into our lives, then we're not living wise. That's what we'll see in the book of Proverbs when we get there next week. That most of the time, the difference between wisdom and foolishness is not here, it's here. It's not what we do in our heads, it's what we do with our hands and our feet. It's where we go. It's the things that we actually do. So wisdom has to be applied. And that's where we'll see, if you study the life of Solomon, that's where he gets himself into trouble. He starts out really well, and he's got a lot of head knowledge, and he starts out on the right path, but then makes a lot of decisions that lead his life down all sorts of paths. And he ends up being this really interesting character in the biblical story, because he's known as the king of wisdom, as the writer of the wisdom books of the Bible, but at the same time, when you read his story, he leaves Israel in a very dangerous and precarious spot, so much so that after he dies, the whole thing falls apart. I'm not saying it's all his fault, but some of his choices contributed directly to the downfall of the country, of the nation. So all that to say, wisdom, it has to be sought after. You have to go after it. You have to find it with God, and once you have it, you have to apply it. That's what it means. So we're going to be studying for the next few weeks these wisdom literature books, these books that teach us about good living, about what it means to live well. And the first one in the Bible is the book of Job. It's a really fascinating book. It's perhaps one of the most important books ever written on the topic of suffering, which if you want to live well, if you want to be wise, at some point you have to address suffering, because it's part of life. It's going to happen. Job says later on in the book of Job, he says, man is born for trouble as sparks fly upward. It's like when you throw a log into the fire, the sparks fly upward and you see them kind of fly into the sky and then fade out. And he said, that's what trouble's like. It's just going to happen. You're going to encounter suffering in this life at some point. There's no way to avoid it. Even if you isolate yourself off from everybody else, at some point, something will happen. Usually, sometimes it's to people that we love or care about. Sometimes it's as our bodies age. Sometimes it's just tragedies in the world around us. But suffering is a part of life in this world. And the wise person, according to the Bible, is the one who has thought deeply about suffering and learned to live faithfully in the middle of suffering. Learn to live as people of integrity, as people who honor God when things go sideways. And that's where the book of Job comes in. It's one of the most important books ever written on this topic, and one of the most sophisticated. So fascinating about the book of Job is it resists easy answers to the problem of suffering. We live in a world today where there's all sorts of self-help books out there, and most of them are aimed at addressing suffering. They're aimed at addressing internal anxieties or stressors. They're aimed at addressing, how to live a happy or well-adjusted life, and most of them will give you kind of pat answers, simple strategies to apply. And that's why they're so frustrating. Because if you've ever really been through suffering, like deep suffering, you know that there are no pat answers. And that's what makes it so difficult. And that's why so many of us, when we face it, we run into it and then we sort of bounce off of it and just distract ourselves with different coping mechanisms to try to get through it. But the book of Job looks at suffering head on and approaches it from every possible angle and leads us to this place where we are never, it's not that we're going to be happy about it, but we can learn how to live through it with integrity and as people of faith. It's a fascinating book. The character Job is one of the oldest characters in the Bible. So it says, if you read the story, that there's this man, the very first line says, in the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. Now, we actually don't know where that is, where the city of Uz is, or the territory of Uz, however you want to say it. Either way, it's not attractive. Whether you say Uz or Uz, it's just kind of a gross name. But regardless, we don't know where it is. A lot of scholars think it's in Edom, which is going to be kind of east of Israel. But that name is very old. It goes way back before the time of Abraham. So many scholars think that Job is a character who predates Abraham. So we're talking about a story that goes back way before the history of the kings, way before the Exodus, way before Egypt, all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia. And there's this character there named Job. And his life is fascinating because he's a good guy. He is a man of faith and integrity. He's a man who's generous, and he's a man who has been blessed richly by God. And then one day, his life falls apart. He loses just about everything. And this story is the story of how he and the people around him respond to that suffering. And it's got a very interesting format, too, because if you've read the book, the first 2 chapters are like a narrative. They're a story. And they read kind of like a normal story. You know, if you were telling a story, it's then he did this, and then he said that, and then she said this, and so on and so forth. But then when you get to chapter 3, the whole tone changes, and it becomes a poem for the next 35 chapters. It's this epic poem that uses language that, and I'm not even just saying this, that uses language that rivals Shakespeare. I mean, this is some of the most beautiful and sophisticated poetry ever written in the history of the world. I had the privilege of studying the book of Job in my 3rd year Hebrew class. It was me and one other student. We'd go to my professor's house over on 18th Street, and we would sit there over dinner and read the book of Job together. And it was so irritating, so frustrating, because the language is so sophisticated. It was well beyond our capacity. I mean, I'd learned a lot of Hebrew by that point, but the Bible itself has something like 500 words that are unique, that only appear one time in the Bible. You know, so if you read the entire Old Testament, there are like 500 Hebrew words that only appear once, and about 200 of them are in the book of Job alone. So it just gets really rich and really deep and really complicated, and we got to read this together. It's beautiful poetry. And then the very last bit returns to a normal narrative story. So the reason I bring that up is a lot of scholars think that these are actually 2 different pieces that were assembled. That we have this story of this character named Job who suffered unjustly, didn't do anything wrong, but it's this kind of famous story that has been told for generations. Maybe it's been told from family to family to family. And then you have this poem in the middle that seems to have been written by a really brilliant, spirit-filled author to try to wrestle with this problem. So it's like they've taken an old story and repurposed it to really wrestle with the question at the core of it. Does that make sense? So we have this frame, this narrative frame, filled with a poetic centerpiece, all wrestling with the problem of suffering. What's interesting about it, though, is that that's not really the core of the issue if you read the narrative frame. Okay, I'm going to read you a section of it here, starting in verse 6, just to give you the idea. So the story starts out with Job. It says he's this really good guy. As a matter of fact, it uses 2 words to describe him: blameless and upright. Blameless and upright. So in Hebrew, it's pure and just. So that's what you want to know about Job. He is pure and just. He's blameless and upright. And the story tells us that at least 5 times. Over and over again, it uses this language to show Job is a good guy. Job is a good guy. Now, why is it telling us that? So that we don't think that the suffering is his fault. The narrator wants us to know that what happens to him has nothing to do with any mistakes he's made. Job is blameless and upright. He's pure and just. He's a good man. That's how the story starts. But then notice this in verse 6, and this is where things get interesting. We move from Job to this scene in the heavens. This is a kind of a visual exercise that the author wants us to go on. He says, one day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and the Satan also came with them. And the Lord said to the Satan, "Where have you come from?" And he answered the Lord, "From roaming throughout the earth, going to and fro on it." And the Lord said to the Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him." Listen, he is blameless and upright. Second time we hear this in the story. A man who fears God and shuns evil. The Satan says, does Job fear God for nothing? Okay? That question is the core of the book of Job. Does Job fear God for nothing? Satan replied, "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and surely he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to the Satan, "Very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." So the Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. And what follows then is Job's suffering. Kind of in quick succession, he loses all of his servants, he loses all of his flocks, which that's his wealth, and then he loses his family, all except his wife. Okay, so one after another, he gets reports that his entire life has just fallen apart shortly after this encounter between God and the Satan. Now, I think it's interesting and important to go back to that encounter to see what's actually happening here, okay? Because the question for us when we read the book of Job is what? Why does God allow suffering to happen to good people? That's the question for us. But the question at the heart of it is what? Is it possible to love God just for God's sake? That's the question that God and the Satan are wrestling over. Okay? The Satan comes into the presence of God with all these other angels. It's this weird, this is not necessarily supposed to be taken as the way things are. It's picture this as heaven is maybe operating. He comes into the presence of God, and God says, hey, have you seen my servant Job? Now, why does he do this? Because he wants to point out to the devil, to the Satan. Now, I keep saying the Satan because it's not a name, it's a title. It means the accuser. He wants to point out to him that it's possible for someone to be good for no reason. As a friend of mine says, good for nothing. Good just because. Because that was always, if you read the story of the Bible, that's the heart of contention between God and the Satan. See, here he's an angelic character who lived in the presence of God, and that wasn't enough for him. He had this ambition to be God, to replace God. He wanted more than just the presence of God. He wanted something else beside just the presence of God. It wasn't enough for him. And so here's this being, this angelic being, who's responsible for much of the chaos in the world because of his ambition and his greed, his drive for more than God. And God is saying it doesn't have to be that way. I think it's fascinating here that God is in this moment not trying to teach Job a lesson, not trying to teach all of us a lesson. He's trying to teach the Satan, the devil, a lesson. He's trying to say to him, it's possible just to love me for me. And the Satan can't wrap his head around it. He can't get there. He says, no. The only reason anybody loves you is because of what you do for him. That's it. This character, Job, he fears you. Fear doesn't mean like he's afraid of you. I mean, he's in awe of you. He worships you. He obeys you. He loves you because you give stuff to him. That's the only reason. And God says, okay, let's see. Let's see. I mean, the Satan actually, what's interesting about this is the Satan proposes the suffering. I think this is so fascinating because a lot of people read this story and they get angry at God. How can God enter into this wager where Job is going to suffer so much? That's not the point here. The point here is what? God says, it's possible to love me for me. Look at Job. He's doing it. And the Satan says, no. Let me hurt him, and you'll see it's not true. Whose idea is the suffering? It's the Satan's. From the beginning. The Bible has made it clear. Suffering is not God's idea. It's not his intention. It's not his plan. It's not his will. It's not what he wants for us. However, he does allow it. He is in control. I think it's so fascinating. We tend to live with, as Christians, we tend to live with a very comic book version of the Bible where there are these two sort of great characters. There's God and the devil that are like locked in mortal combat, you know, the force of good and the force of evil. But that's not what the picture the Bible paints. The Bible paints a picture where God is all good and all strong and all sovereign. And the devil is much smaller, much less significant. He comes here, and what's he doing? He's asking permission. He has to ask permission. There is no duality. It's not a great force of good and a great force of evil duking it out. It's good. Good is the foundation of the world. God's goodness is everything. And the devil is a stain on that. He's a corruption that God for a time is allowing. He has to ask permission to do anything, and God limits his control very clearly. He's on a leash here. Now that said, God does still allow it. And that creates some problems for us, because we want to ask the question, why? Why does he allow it? Why didn't he just say no? Why didn't he say, I already know Job's heart. He doesn't have to be tested. He doesn't have to prove anything to me. I think in this moment it's because he's trying to prove something to the Satan. I don't want to take that too far and say that that's what's happening in every situation with suffering, but in this moment, that's the heart of it. He's trying to get through to this being that it's possible to love me for me. It's possible to desire me not for the gifts I give, but for myself. And so he allows Job to suffer. But the Satan is the one who causes it. He's the one who desired it, he's the one that suggested it, and he's the one that acts it out. And God limits it for a very specific reason. And so Job suffers. He loses his family, he loses his wealth, he loses his servants all in one day. And at the end of the first chapter, we see Job's response to suffering. It's fascinating. It says in verse 20, "At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head, and then he fell on the ground in worship and said, 'Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall depart. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. May the name of the Lord be praised.'" Fascinating response. And this is where we get this picture that Job is this heroic character in the Bible. Because in this moment, his response is so good and so faithful and so true. But in 2 chapters, he's going to take it all back. I shouldn't say that. He's not going to take it back, but his tone's going to change significantly. What I think is so interesting is in verse 22, it says, "In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing." So it's clear. Even when suffering hits, Job is still faithful. By the end of chapter 1, as one pastor says, the score is Satan 0, Job 1. He still hasn't sinned. What's interesting, though, is he will change his tone dramatically in chapter 3. He'll start to mourn and get angry. He'll start to bargain. He'll start to be depressed. He'll start to do all the things that we do in suffering. And even then, the Bible's clear. In all this, Job didn't sin with his mouth. I think we often read the first chapter of Job and we think of Job as this heroic character, and that's how we're all supposed to be in the middle of suffering. But we don't read the rest of it and see that he went on the roller coaster like the rest of us do. That suffering is never a linear experience for us. That some of us have moments like Job where it's like, I get it. I see clearly that God is still good. And you can feel that way in the middle of suffering. And then 5 minutes later feel completely different. 5 minutes later feel like God is nowhere and you have no idea what's going on. You can go from worshiping to screaming to crying to bargaining to the whole gamut of emotions, because suffering is not a linear thing. I think in this moment, Job knew the right answer in his head. What he says here is true, and it's powerful when you think about it. He says, look, I had all this stuff in the first place because God gave it to me. And now he's taken it away. Just as he had the right to give it to me, he has the right to take it away. Because he's God and I'm not. And I enjoyed the gifts he gave while I had them. And now I weep because I lost them, but I'm not going to blame him. Because he gets to do what he wants to do. It's all his. And I think part of the problem for many of us when it comes to suffering is we're so entitled. I'm speaking for myself here. We feel so entitled to the things we have. It's like, I earned this. I deserve this. Everything that I have is mine. I've worked hard for this. Or you know, I've done the hard work of relationship for this relationship. I've done the hard work to make this money or to buy this thing or whatever it is, and we feel like it's ours. Or Job says, no. I understand that everything I have is a gift. Everything I have is on loan. I am not entitled to any of it. If God wants it back, it's his. It's going to hurt, but it's his. So in this moment, it's so good, and it's so biblical, and it's so faithful, and it's so heroic. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. There's nothing trite about this. This is not just sort of a glib statement. Job has thought deeply about this. It's all his. Blessed be the name of the Lord. May the name of the Lord be praised. It's powerful until the next chapter. When the Satan in chapter 2 goes back into the presence of God and God says, see, what did I tell you? And what does the Satan says? He says, well, a man will do anything to protect his own body. It's just because you wouldn't let me hurt him. Let me hurt his body, and then he'll curse you to your face. So God says, fine. You want to inflict suffering on his body. You can do anything, but don't kill him. And so the Bible says that Job is now inflicted with these boils, these sores all over his body. So much so that he begins to scrape at his skin with broken pieces of pottery. I mean, the picture is dismal. He sits in an ash heap outside of his town, ostracized from his community. He's lost everything, scraping at his body with pottery. He has 3 friends that will come up to see him, and he's so far gone they don't even recognize him. I mean, it's a dismal and dark picture. And in this moment, Job's wife comes to him, and she represents another way of responding to suffering. We've already seen faithful Job respond to suffering. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. She comes in, and what does she say? She says to him, are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die. What's her approach to suffering? That's what many people out there will say. Suffering just is. Doesn't matter if you're good or bad, it's going to happen, so what do we care? What does it matter if you're a good or bad person? What does it matter if you worship God or not? You know, the rain falls on the just and unjust. Who cares? So just curse God. It doesn't even matter. It's just random. It's just the world we live in. Just curse him and die. Stop fighting to hold on to him. Stop holding on to your integrity. Stop holding on to your blameless and upright character. Stop being such a good guy and just say whatever you're feeling and then die. She has this very cynical approach to suffering, which is what a lot of people out there will tell you, you know? Life's hard. You just have to try to get through it. There is no rhyme or reason to it. Suffering just happens. Doesn't matter if you're good or bad. That's Job's wife's response. And Job looks at her and says, you're speaking like a foolish woman. And he refuses her advice. However, I know we're covering a lot here. The book of Job is 42 chapters, and we're talking about all of it tonight, okay? But, however, in the next chapter, in chapter 3, when the poem starts, chapter 3 starts out with these words. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. He said, may the day of my birth perish, the night that said a boy is conceived. That day may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine on it. He's looking at his life and saying, man, I wish I was never born. And this kicks off a series of conversations between Job and his 3 friends, where they're wrestling deeply with the problem of suffering. We've already seen faithful Job's response. Faithful Job's response, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. His wife's response, there is no rhyme or reason. It doesn't matter if you're a good person or not. Just die. just let it all go and die. Now we see Job a little bit more in a realistic light, where he's starting to wrestle deeply with this. He's depressed. I wish I was never born. He's suicidal at points. He begins to challenge God and say, God, I think you got this wrong. I think you're actually on the wrong side of this thing. And he'll use the same words that God used to describe him. I'm innocent. I'm blameless. I'm upright. And we know that's true. So Job is making a very true argument to God. He's saying, if I'm blameless and if I'm upright, then why is all this happening? Why am I in this situation? He's railing against God and saying, God, you must have gotten this wrong. You are unjust here, not me. And I love the fact that God allows him to talk to him that way. He allows him to go after him. When we get to the end of the book of Job, after Job has had chapter upon chapter of railing against God, of yelling and shaking his fist at the heavens, pounding on the door of heaven and demanding an answer, saying, God, you got this wrong. You're unjust. I can't believe you've done this to me. You better show up and defend yourself. This is how Job is talking to him. And at the end of the book of Job, you know what it says? In all of this, Job didn't sin with his mouth. Fascinating, isn't it? God creates space for human suffering. He creates space for us to cry out, for us to shake our fists, for us to say, why are you doing this to me? For us to demand an answer, for us to even say, you got this wrong, and still be faithful. Because you know what Job never does? He never turns away. He always goes after God. Like David, I said, to be a man after God's own heart means you take whatever you have in your hands to God. That's what Job does. He takes whatever he has and he goes after him, and he keeps on demanding over and over again in the most poetic and creative of ways that God show up. That he show up and he answer, that he show up and he speak with Job. That's all Job wants. Just show up for me. And so he's going after him. It's kind of like that picture of Jacob. Remember when Jacob wrestled with God in the wilderness? And it says he held on to him and refused to let go until he received a blessing. That's what Job is doing. He's Jacob part 2 here. He's saying, I will not let go of you until you answer me, until you explain yourself to me. He doesn't walk away in anger. He's still faithful. And that's why he didn't sin in what he did. He's still going after God. Now, his 3 friends are a little bit different, because his 3 friends represent kind of modern wisdom on suffering. They represent the self-help section at the Barnes & Noble. Because they come in and they say to him, Job starts out shaking his fist at God. I wish I was never born. I didn't do anything wrong. I have no idea why this is happening. And they all look at him and they say, you're nuts. There's no way that this would be happening if there wasn't some hidden sin in you. That was contemporary wisdom on suffering. Actually, you see that in the Gospels too. Remember? There's a guy who's born blind. And the disciples come to Jesus and they say what? Who sinned? This man's mother or father? Which one of them sinned to make him this way? That was contemporary understanding. If somebody's suffering, it's because somebody in their life, whether them or their father or their grandfather, there's some deep, dark, hidden secret. And for chapter upon chapter, Job's 3 friends go after him, saying, I know you're saying you're blameless and upright. I know you're saying you didn't do anything to deserve this, but there has to be something. And they get really poetic and they get really sophisticated, but really they're saying the same thing. There's this pat answer. If you're suffering, it's because you deserve it. And Job responds every time with this, like, it gets more intense. Every argument, every cycle, it just gets more intense. One friend named Eliphaz, he'll step up and he'll give a speech. And then Job will respond with this kind of ferocious defense of himself. And then the next friend, this guy named Bildad, will get up and give a speech, and then Job will respond. And the whole thing cycles like this as they keep on going back and forth with each other. And my Hebrew professor said, as you read this argument, there's more heat and less light as it gets farther and farther. They're getting more passionate, but less like illumination. There's less clarity, there's less wisdom in their words. And this is why, just as a side note, I often caution people, just because you can find the words in the Bible doesn't mean that they're true. I can't tell you how many times I've heard somebody quote a verse out of the Bible to me, and I'm like, you know who said that? That's Bildad. And he was wrong. So biblical doesn't mean it was found in the Bible. You can find things in the Bible that are not true. Biblical means it's true of the character of God in the whole story. And the stuff that Bildad and Zophar and Eliphaz are saying to Job, it's not true, it's not right. They're telling him, if you're suffering, it's because you screwed up somewhere. And Job's saying, guys, I don't know what to tell you, I didn't. And part of the reason the book of Job exists is to tell us, when it comes to suffering, avoid pat answers. Avoid the self-help section. Avoid simple answers. Avoid anybody who will give you just a little nugget to help you get through. Avoid false comfort. You know, some of you guys know that I'm a chaplain for the Costa Mesa Fire Department. And my first day on the job, I was in the process of getting approved to be a chaplain when I got a call from the chief, and he said, hey, can you come to the hospital in Mission Viejo? One of our firefighters, our fire captains, was just hit by a car. And I got to the hospital and found out that he was off duty, he was at home. He had taken his car to a friend's house to drop off to have his friend fix it, and then he borrowed a bike from his friend and was riding the bike home. He was on the sidewalk in Rancho Santa Margarita, and a 26-year-old who was high got behind the wheel of a car, hopped up on the sidewalk and hit him while he was on the sidewalk. The man was married, had 3 daughters that were waiting for him to get back home to take them to their soccer games, their AYSO soccer games, 6, 8, and 10 years old. And I got to the hospital, I walked in, I saw his wife, I saw the 3 of them just as the doctor came out to say, his brain's it's gone. I mean, like crazy. Nobody did anything wrong. This kid did something wrong, obviously, but nobody in this family deserved this. And I remember being there and trying to find words of comfort and just feeling like there's nothing I can say. I can just stand here and try to pray and ask God to show up in ways that I can't imagine. But there were a lot of people there who hadn't been in ministry, hadn't walked through circumstances like this, and so they were trying to comfort with the best of intentions. But they would say the dumbest things. I mean, again, with good intentions, but they would say things like, God has a plan in all this. And I just thought, he's going to do something with this, but this wasn't his will. Like don't say that God's plan was for this to happen. Because that's devastating to somebody's faith. I remember the worst one I heard was this guy really, really sincerely meant it, and I appreciate his efforts at comforting, but he said to him, God must have needed him up in heaven more than we need him here. And I thought, what? The Bible makes it really clear that God doesn't need anybody. His daughters needed him, though, for sure. So there's these kind of false comforts, and even at his funeral, it's people saying this stuff that's just like simple answers to the problem of suffering. And that's what Job's friends are trying to do here. They're genuinely trying to comfort him. They seem to be decent guys. When they show up on the scene, at the end of chapter 2, you know what it says? It says they sat with him in the ashes for 7 days without saying a word. I mean, that's not a bad friend that's going to sit with you in the dirt for 7 days without speaking. They had good intentions. But then when it came time to comfort, they offered this like false, simple answer to a really complex problem of suffering. And the book of Job wants to tell us, no matter what it is, those are not the answers. Suffering is not just because somebody doesn't have enough faith. It's not necessarily because they've done something wrong or they deserve it. It's not necessarily because of some generational curse on their family. It's not necessarily because God has this plan that he's kind of pulling the strings and messing with us. It's not, on and on the list goes. Whatever the self-help book is, whatever the Hallmark card says, that's not it. That's not it. And the book of Job exists to defy simple answers to the problem of suffering. The only answer we're going to get here is going to come from God at the end. As Job is crying out, his friends are yelling at him, telling him, you must have screwed up. He's saying, I didn't. If God would just show up, I could prove it. I could make him look at me and tell me I'm innocent. And Job is demanding that God shows up. And then finally, in Job chapter 38, God shows up. And I love this scene. It says God shows up in a whirlwind. This storm builds, like these clouds. It reminds me, you guys seen the movie Forrest Gump? My son's on a Forrest Gump kick, but it reminds me of Lieutenant Dan. Remember the guy that lost his legs? He's sitting up at the top of the shrimp boat and he's like screaming at God, and I just love it because it says, Lieutenant Dan's sitting up there on top of the boat and he's saying, where are you? Where are you? And Forrest Gump says, it's funny that he should say that because at that moment God showed up and this storm rolls in, and Lieutenant Dan and God are yelling at each other through this storm, and at the end of it, he makes peace with God through this kind of storm experience. And that section is based on the book of Job because that's what happens. Job's yelling at God, you show up, and God shows up in a thunderstorm. And what he says to Job is the most fascinating thing of all time. This is Job chapter 38. I'm just going to read a few verses because it goes on for 4 chapters. But this is 38. He says, I flipped to Psalm somehow. I was like, wait, that's not the right words. Here we go. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said, who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you will answer me. And then God says, where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Who laid its cornerstones while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? And for 4 chapters, God just pummels Job with all of the things that he can do in the world, with all of his natural, the natural wonder of the world, with all of the creatures that he tames with the word, with all of the processes that he oversees. And there have been a lot of commentators through the years who've been frustrated by this because they're like, God is not addressing Job's question. Job's question is, why am I suffering if I haven't done anything wrong? And God comes in and says, can you do this? Do you know this? Have you ever done this? Can you answer this? And a lot of commentators will look at it and say, well, God's not giving him an answer to his question. And I say, exactly. That's the brilliance of the book of Job. Because if God gave him an answer to his question, if he said, well, let me explain to you why you're suffering. Okay? You're suffering because I'm having this kind of conversation with the devil over here. And I wanted to prove to him that you could love me for no reason. And if you can just do that, if you can help me to win this bargain, here's what's going to happen. People are going to tell stories about you for generations. And it's going to get passed down across the entire world. You're going to be more famous because of this than you would have ever been otherwise. People will be talking about you in Costa Mesa, California, 3,000, 4,000 years from now. You're going to be an example of hope and endurance and perseverance for everybody around the world. That's true. All of this is true, isn't it? Job has taught us more about suffering than anybody in the history of the world by the way that he suffered, by his faithfulness. And God could have told him that. I'm going to use you to encourage countless people. And then what would have Job done? He would have embraced suffering for the sake of heroism. He would have embraced suffering as a martyr. He would have gone through it faithfully in order to be this great character. And the Satan's question would have been answered. Does he love God for God? No. He loves God because God's going to make him famous. Because he's going to use him in powerful ways. He loves God because God has a plan for his life. That's why he loves God. He loves God because God's going to make him even greater than he could have ever been. And if that's what God says to him, if he gives him an answer, then the answer becomes what Job was after the whole time. But he doesn't. What does he say instead? He says, dear one, you have no idea what you're talking about. My world is so much bigger than yours. Like, I can't even begin to describe to you how small your perspective is compared to what I see. And my world is vast and complicated because sin has entered into it, and with sin, danger and suffering that I never intended. And I can't begin to tell you how complex this whole system is. I can't even help you understand just how the magnitude of my creation and how dangerous it is just to live in it, and how many things I save you from every single day without you knowing it. You have no idea. You're just going to have to trust me. You're just going to have to trust me. That's it. Now, C.S. Lewis has this great book. After his wife died, it's called A Grief Observed. It's basically his journals that he published. And it says, when his wife first died, he would kind of, in prayer, he would show up to heaven, banging on the doors of heaven. And he just felt like it was just closed in his face, like God was just not talking to him. And he would bang on the doors, and God wouldn't answer. And he'd just get so furious, and he'd eventually just give up and walk away. And after a time, he just wore himself out, banging on the doors. And so one day, in prayer, he shows up to heaven with a different posture, kind of resolved, depressed. And he finds that the door's cracked open a little bit. And he walks inside and sits down at the table, and God's across the table from him. And he starts to ask the questions he once asked, wants God to answer. And God just looks back at him and says, dear one, you just don't understand. You're just going to have to trust me. And that's the only answer he got. You're just going to have to trust me. And that's what Job says to him, or what God says to him here in 4 chapters. I'm so sorry. You just can't see what I can see. And there is no simple answer that I can give you. Because if I gave you a simple answer, you would cling to it, and that would become your God. That would become the thing that you care about most, is that answer. But instead, I'm just going to ask you to trust me. And I'm just going to ask, can I be enough for you? Just me. And Job responds in verse 42. I love this. He says, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I didn't understand, things too wonderful for me. You said, listen now and I will speak, and I will question you and you will answer me. Listen to this. I love this. He says, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and I repent in dust and ashes. Yeah, I'd heard about you. Remember? Job chapter 1. I heard about you, so I knew the right answer. I knew what I was supposed to say in that moment. But now that I've seen you, even though you didn't give me any answers, that's the crazy part about the book of Job. The question at the core of the book of Job is, why is there suffering? And it does not answer it for us. It refuses any simple answer. All it gives us is God. And when Job sees him, he says, that's enough. That's enough. That's all I wanted. And he's satisfied. He moves forward now into a new space. God is so much bigger. See, that's what suffering does, is it blows up our box. We have God in a little tiny box, but when you suffer, that box explodes and you see him so much bigger than he was before. That's what happens to Job, and he says, I trust you. You're good enough. And what's so fascinating about it is after this, you know what God says? God says to him, you know that stuff you said about me? It's okay. In all of this, Job didn't sin with his mouth, but he looks at Job's 3 friends and he says, how dare you? I love this. How dare you? You misrepresented me to a man who was suffering. How dare you? You know what God says? I'm going to tell Job that he's going to pray for you. And when he prays for you, when he intercedes for you, then I'll forgive the 3 of you for the ways you spoke wrongly about me. I love that. And so the story ends with Job praying for his 3 friends because he has seen God clearly and they haven't. He prays and he intercedes and God forgives the 3 friends. And I think it's so beautiful and powerful. And really what we have here then is what? A model of Jesus. Just a glimpse of Jesus, right? An innocent sufferer who did nothing to deserve his fate, who through suffering makes intercession for those of us who got it wrong and brings forgiveness. Isn't that what Jesus did on the cross? Father, forgive them. They have no idea what they're doing. They can't see you the way I can see you. But if through my suffering I can make intercession for them, then forgive them. And Jesus becomes the true Job, the one who was truly innocent. See, Job had stuff in his story, I'm sure. But Jesus didn't. Jesus was truly innocent. He suffered for us and makes intercession for us through suffering so that we can see God clearly. It's a beautiful story that leaves us without an answer, but with a person. And it leaves us with a question. Is that enough? Is that enough? Can we love him? Can we fear him? Can we worship him? Can we obey him just for him? No matter what's going on in life, no matter what he brings into our life or takes out of it. Is he enough? Do we trust him? Let's pray.